Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to another Final Fantasy XIV ranking video. It's a Realm Reborn's 10th anniversary, and for that, I'm doing all sorts of nostalgic style videos covering the old content that a lot of newer players wouldn't have been around for when it was fresh, and people who were might just want to remember the good old days, as some people, well, probably don't call it. Now, last week I talked about the binding coils of Bahamut, all three of the raid tiers throughout A Realm Reborn, and so this week I wanted to talk about the extreme trials that were releasing parallel to all the other content. We all know that extreme trials release pretty much every patch nowadays, but A Realm Reborn was a pretty special era. It didn't work quite the same way back then, and so I thought it'd be fun to also look at those now that we've brushed up on the other part of the A Realm Reborn endgame. I think it's going to be a fun one to rank from my least favorite to my most favorite, and we'll see how much of that is affected by the release of things like Unreal, giving me a fresher perspective on some of those encounters. Either way, we've got a lot to discuss, so let's get started. Now, one thing I do want to lead with is exactly what I'm going to be covering, because while I did say extreme trials, there were actually a lot more endgame trials as a whole back in A Realm Reborn. So I need to give some honorable mention to the ones that won't actually be included in this ranking. Things like the Chrysalis and the Steps of Faith were majorly impactful trials that were part of the main scenario quests, and they were not something you could completely walk over. That stands true for most of the hard mode trials, including Ifrit, Garuda, and Titan, which are actually the gateway into the binding coil of Bahamut back then. However, from 2.1 onward, we would get extreme trials, sometimes more than one in a patch. And so I really want to focus on that upper echelon of trial. Maybe we go back and talk about the implications and the impact on the difficulty of main scenario trials in a future video. But for now, I just want to mention the 5 that aren't here. I already mentioned the Chrysalis and the Steps of Faith, and Steps of Faith is one that's definitely worth looking back on. But we also had all of the Hildebrand trials. We had Battle at Big Bridge, Battle at Big Keep, and the Dragon's Neck Coliseum. Again, none of these were that hard, but they also weren't something you could just walk over either. So some people might have expected them to be in this list, and sorry to say, but they won't be. I like them, and maybe they'll make their way into a future video, but for now, we're going to focus on the difficult stuff. So now let's get started on that ranking. All right, so we have 9 extreme trials on my list, and I definitely know which one is my least favorite. Coming in at number 9, Moggle Mog Extreme. Thornmarch Extreme. I could barely even say the word because it was, just don't like this trial at all. I'll just be outright with it. The fight sucked. To deal damage to Moggle Mog himself, you have to weaken the health bars of the little Moogles before you actually kill any of them, because as soon as you kill one of them, Moggle Mog will restore all of their health to max and sacrifice his own health to do so. Now, on paper, that's actually fine and probably sounds like a really interesting prospect to a lot of people. But it made things like damage over time abilities, pets, and even just little auto attacks just an absolute nightmare. You would just have accidental deaths early, you'd have people who would dot, and then people who wouldn't control damage, and people who just wouldn't look at HP bars, and we all know how difficult it is for people to stop hitting buttons, whether it be because of an HP check or because of something like a stillness mechanic. Ugh. Either way, not to mention, most of the mechanics just weren't great by any measure. It also only dropped accessories, it didn't have an extreme trial mount, so outside of Moogle-themed accessory glam, and I guess for some people an item level upgrade, it was just such a drag. At least hard mode had weapons, and the crafted weapons would come later, but this extreme trial, I would just leave it in the trash, and I never want to see it return in any form. Now, number 8 on this list, I wasn't sure if I wanted to include it in my ranking. I went back and forth just because of the nicknames that we had for it, and that's Earth's Fount. Now, some people called it Odin Hard Mode, some people called it Odin Extreme, but I think it has just enough difficulty to earn a spot on this list. Now, this fight was added in patch 2.5, but it actually made its debut at FanFest as a battle challenge that people could take on in person to earn a shirt. It was a bit easier at FanFest. You could silence some attacks and just didn't deal as much damage, didn't have as tight of a DPS check or anything like that. But in the final release, you know, they amped the damage up a little bit. They got rid of some of that counterplay by getting rid of the silences. And yeah, it was actually a pretty fun fight. It had some nifty attacks. A lot of them just dealt massive damage. Some of it based on your max HP. So even if you go in now and get hit by some of that stuff, it'll chunk you completely. Tanks would get destroyed by the tank buster, and then just a ton of AoEs and AoE raid damage that came out. There was even a DPS check at the very end where you have to kill him before he finishes casting the Shin Zantetsuken skill. And that actually scared a lot of people. I had plenty of groups that could do the mechanics fine up to that point, but couldn't bring it home in the last 15%. Maybe because of a bad phase push, or just because, you know, dodging mechanics is one thing, dealing damage is another. But at its core, it really is just a lot of dodging AoEs. And if your group is really good, you skip a lot of those AoEs as a whole, and it gets even lamer and lamer. It just isn't really very interesting of a fight outside of it dealing very serious damage and actually still getting people with that final sequence at the end. Not to mention the rewards were just individual glam versions of the full body suit that you could get from the Fate. So much like Mogomog, the reward structure was just kind of weird and unsatisfying. At the very least, it did come with some story-related quests that give more background on Odin. So if you haven't done those quests, I would highly recommend it. Now we move on to number 7. I think we got the two that were most likely expected to be at the bottom out of the way. And at this point, it's a matter of taste. And the next one for me is Ifrit Extreme. Honestly, I could have even put this one below Odin. I really don't like Ifrit Extreme. I just don't find it very fun. I do think that at the very least, they captured the idea of Extreme being an escalation of hard mode very, very well in this encounter. I mean, it's pretty much all the same mechanics as hard mode. There's more eruptions, there's more plumes, there's more dashes, you know, there's more nails. There's so many nails. And on top of that, you needed, you know, careful damage control and make sure you were mitigating things, and the tank buster was actually quite scary. But at the end of the day, it just wasn't that interesting. Not to mention the new mechanics that they added. Searing Wind was your healer has to stand away from the group, and I know that sounds easy, but let me tell you, oh man, the number of times a healer wouldn't move out and just insta-kill everybody, or someone would just move into the healer because they just forgot that it was even happening in the first place, because it's not a very interactive mechanic. Ugh. And then there's a chain between, like, I think the off tank and one of the DPS that if you were far apart, you took more damage, or it like dealt more damage to you over time, and you dealt less damage, which could make killing the nails harder. And that was like all that they added that wasn't just multiplying what was already there. I don't know. It just was always so uninteresting to me, but at the same time, it was still good for the game in the patch that it came out, 2.1, which was the first patch that we actually got extremes in A Realm Reborn. I just wish it was better, especially because it was the last of the 3 extremes in sequence for the quest that you needed to do. So, yeah, definitely wasn't how I would have ended it, especially given what one of the other 3 extremes was. Next on the list is Minstrel's Ballad, Ultima's Bane. You know, again, this almost doesn't count as an extreme, and I'll talk about why in a little bit. But, you know, on paper, this should have been super exciting. This was the first time they, you know, took a final boss from the story and gave us a harder version of it. And this is something they've done every expansion since, to varying degrees of success. Looking at you, Endsinger. But I mean, the final boss of Praetorium, the Ultima weapon, one of the most iconic Final Fantasy bosses, super bosses that's been present in a ton of games. And on top of that, you know, got a difficulty bump, new accessories, all this extra damage, but it's only barely harder. It's really just the amount of damage that it deals that kind of catches people off guard. It's still just, you know, dodge Ifrit eruptions and dodge, you know, weight of the land, and, you know, don't get knocked in front of Garuda's cleave. It's like the mechanics in the first 50% aren't really much different than normal mode. I think most people probably got past the first 50% mark in a single pull even back then. And then the last 50%, it's really just tons of lasers, kill the Magitech bits, you know, mitigate and dodge the proximity AoEs. And then the orbs. Honestly, the orbs are pretty much the entire fight. You just have to make sure that you deal with the split damage. And that was kind of a thing back then. You know, we didn't know those were split damage the first time we did it because there were no split damage indicators. You just had to see, wow, that did a lot of damage. Maybe we need multiple people to get hit by it. And that's like all the information that you were going to get. Now, that being said, I still did enjoy it. It was simple at the very least, and you could actually just do it with a group of friends, and it wasn't all that bad. And that became really true when it came back as an Unreal encounter. But if I'm to grade it based on the quality of the actual fight, it's just kind of disappointing. I mean, it's weird how Ultima weapon just kind of has that air about it. I mean, it's a final boss of a story dungeon, which is now in its own separate trial, actually. And that separate trial makes me want them to redo the Minstrel's Ballad version, oddly enough, and also kind of makes me want them to redo Uwu. It's just Ultima's just like easy. Like, I don't know, it's just always associated with that. But then it's not even just me. Yoshi P himself said they didn't want to call it an extreme trial in patch 2.1 because they didn't think it was on the same caliber as like Ifrit, Garuda, and Titan. So, I mean, even if they didn't want to do it, then, you know, you can see why I'm kind of conflicted about it. But I still like it more than Ifrit, so it ends up here. Speaking of Garuda, like I just mentioned, Garuda's next on the list. And I think from this point on the list, it's kind of just like they're a lot closer than the first 4 on the list were. I like and dislike different things about them, and they could be, depending on my mood, interchangeable. But Garuda is going to be my number 5. This was our first extreme trial at all in A Realm Reborn, and it was a great one to start out with, in my opinion. It has a lot of really subtle mechanic changes and incorporates a more raid-esque use of the arena than we see in most of the trials. Now, the first phase introduces the new Suparna and Charada, which were the ads from the hard mode, and unfortunately for those of you who watched my guide to this way back when, they also meant many deaths. Yeah, so Charada was supposed to be just tanked by the party while the other tank grabbed Suparna, and that was known as the triangle strat. It became the standard strat over in JP, and people who would stop and think about it a little bit would also have done that over here in NA. It's just because of a split damage cleave that Charada does, and that Suparna does this massive like AoE tank buster style attack that was always killing people. And yeah, I apologize for that one looking back, but at the same time, it's just because I was doing it with people with a lot of gear, and so we're just like, oh wow, yeah, we could just do it that way, and that's just kind of what ended up sticking. And that was a big problem with a lot of trials, especially way back when. Less of a problem now because they're more dancey than they are any other way, I guess, if that makes sense, but it is what it is. Now, those things do repeat in phase 2. You will have Charada and Suparna again, but with the infamous spiny plume mixed in. This little tiny plume that just lays down tank busters that give you this debuff, and if the debuff gets high enough, it blows up and just damages everyone. Oh man, that thing was scary, and all you had to do was tank swap it and mitigate the hit while you were dealing with the ads at the same time, and that was a monstrous problem for a lot of people. Honestly, that plume's like one of the hardest hitting things in Ultimate for Ultima weapon as well, but it actually became a really engaging EX mechanic because you're actually doing a bunch of other stuff while you're dealing with that spiny plume. There's also a bunch of other plumes you need to kill, including one that if you don't kill it fast enough will put everyone to sleep. Probably the worst mechanic, just because if it goes off, you just sit there and wait because you're probably going to die to like an AoE or something that's going to happen, and it's like this slow burn of pain that you just wish wasn't happening. Honestly, I think the most unfortunate thing about that encounter is none of those things I mentioned are Garuda. Garuda's just kind of there, does, you know, a cleave that you need to avoid, does, you know, a tank buster and whatnot, but Garuda herself is so not the focus of her own extreme, and that's just kind of, I don't know, it's a little lame. But at the very least, it has a lot of really positive things about it. And I think if we had gotten it Unreal for that one, it would have been fun. But it just lands a little bit further down for those couple of reasons. Then we move on to number 4, Shiva Extreme. Now, next we have the last officially labeled EX trial, given that Odin was something that was more of a formality. This fight actually encapsulates a lot of pretty modern raid design when I look back at it, almost seemingly unintentionally. It has stacks, spreads, and pair mechanics. What else can you say about Final Fantasy XIV Endgame? It all boils down to some variation of those 3 things, and they're key to positioning for the various weapon phases that she has. Not to mention her damage is actually quite high for an EX trial. Every time she changes her weapon, she gets a stacking damage buff, and everything she does that actually hurts. Her autos stack damage resistance debuffs, which I actually really like as a tank mechanic, although they may not have been strong enough even on content. And then her bow autos always crit. We had awareness back then, but nowadays that would be a really scary thing. She spams raid wides as well as just requires constant mitigation, healing, and shielding, and we didn't have a lot of tools back then, so when these things were happening, I mean, you were probably sitting there actually doing GCD heals. We didn't even have a size or asylum or anything. You would have just thrown up a Medica 2 and then a Medica every time she just does this ice spam on the whole party. She also takes less damage in sword and shield form, which can make hitting in rage a real possibility for groups if she uses it frequently, especially less experienced groups. Since she randomly chooses between staff and sword form in the second phase, you just got to be on your toes and know how to react to each of them, and people really weren't good at that back then. So it became a much more engaging fight than I think it actually is on paper. And again, that damage gets really, really scary. Oddly, the thing that stands out as kind of like a negative is the ad phase. It's like, yeah, she can swap to sword during that and then have to do like a party-wide cleave, but the ads themselves just auto attack. They're just there to be damage sponges and aren't really that interesting. Honestly, probably the most troll thing about Shiva Extreme is tanks would do Shiva Extreme where she does this cleave attack that's a party split, but in hard mode, it's not a party split, it's just a tank buster. So you'd always have that tank that's like, oh, let me aim this at the party real quick and just kill everyone. That probably still happens to this day. I haven't done it in the trial roulette in a while. But yeah, there's a lot of really, really positive things about this fight. Just had one other weird thing. In patch 2.45, they introduced upgrade items for her weapons to give them an extra 5 item levels. I don't recall anyone really caring when that happened, so it was just kind of weird that they did it. Oh, she also had the slidey floor. Yeah, that slidey floor. That was not good. There's a lot of people who could not stay still during that. And also, even just her dropping AoEs in kind of like a rotating pattern. Technically, Titan did that too with his bombs. But nowadays, when we see those types of mechanics, players that were around back then will still to this day call them Shiva circles. It's just how it is. So yeah, it's funny how she actually had a pretty large impact on terminology and just the way people handle certain things in raiding. It's very, very ahead of its time, actually. Now we move on to my big 3. These actually, I think I knew were going to be in my top 3. Leviathan Extreme is my number 3. You know, I think if you had asked me this maybe 2-3 years ago, I wouldn't have said this. But like I said at the beginning, you know, I was wondering how much Unreal would really affect my opinion on some of this stuff. And after getting to do it again in Unreal during Shadowbringers, I actually ended up growing a newfound appreciation for the fight. There's a lot of interesting nuance with its mechanics, albeit a bit of grief involved too. The 2 big ones are the head and tail and the mirror debuffs. The head and tail each reflect a different type of damage. The head, I believe, reflects physical, yeah, because the tail is meant for positionals. It has to be. Oh, I think it's actually the head reflects ranged and the tail reflects magic. It's one of the two, but either way, they don't just reflect physical. It's range damage and magic damage. And so, you know, on paper, that's fine. You just need to attack the correct one. But, you know, nowadays we have a lot of incidental AoE and our tanks have mixed damage. Like if you're a paladin or a dark knight, that means you're going to have to attack a specific one. And if you have both of them, then, well, one of them is going to be taking some reflected damage. So it's a little weirder nowadays, but on paper, again, it's still one of those really cool ideas. And for a tank, it's not that big of a deal as long as, you know, your healers aren't completely asleep at the wheel. Speaking of the healers, then you have the mirror mechanic. So a tank would get a mirror debuff, and if you healed that player with whatever spell you had that would heal their health, it would actually give you a stacking debuff, and the debuff with each stack would reduce the range of your healing. Heck, it would reduce the range that you needed to be within, like the range you need to be not just for your AoE casts, but to actually heal somebody, just single target the range that you need to stand from them. So it did something back then where it forced a healer swap, where you were like, okay, I'll heal that tank until I have 3 stacks, and then you'll heal them until you have 3 stacks. And yeah, you would try to avoid that with things like regens or illustrates and whatnot. But the fact that we had this healer swap mechanic that we don't really see ever again. I mean, we're always looking for ways to make certain parts of our game more engaging. And I think not necessarily this exact thing, but mechanics like this do improve engagement when you have to do that. Although nowadays we barely GCD heal at all, so they probably need to do something a little different, but I think you know what I mean. This is other ways to resolve the issue, and I don't know that it would really function the same way nowadays. It also had a ton of ads, all of which were threatening in their own way. You know, they would either just do more damage to people while other AoEs were going off, or they could hysteria you or leave puddles that would hysteria you, either or, because they did both, and you just walk off the edge. So damage control, stuns, all that stuff was really, really important. And of course, the dive bombs, you know, Leviathan dashing across and knocking people off and slowing them down, the arena tilting whenever Leviathan would slam on it. That was really, really cool when it first happened here. Honestly, it's just all really, really interesting. The only thing that knocks off a few points for Leviathan for me is the activation of the barrier to counter tidal wave. Interactables in high-end fights, not something the game does very well. And while this wasn't exactly that bad, it was super finicky. You needed to be in a really short range of it. And if you had even just slightly too little ether, or you were a little too late, or even in some cases a little too early, you were dead. This was true in hard mode too, and I've seen that mistake made a lot of times. Leviathan also had a really weird upgrade system. You had to like get the weapon, and then you had to get a mirror that just, the mirror was super rare. I think I saw it once ever until I like went back and did it unsynced. And yeah, nobody, again, kind of like with Shiva, nobody really cared, but the mirror was out on content, so it was even weirder. Moving on to number 2, and honestly, I knew this one was number 2 the moment I started making this video, because I knew what my number 1 was. And at number 2, we have Ramuh Extreme, one of the weirdest and quirkiest extremes the game has ever had. It has water along most of the arena, and whenever you get hit by lightning, it does this electrifying AoE. So you really have to bunch up and spread out at the same time in this really tight space in the center of the room. And then you can use that outer ring, that outer donut, for positioning for other mechanics. So you have to really know how to use each of them in order to make sure that you did all the mechanics correctly. Ramuh also just leaves behind these lightning orbs when he strikes the arena with lightning. Now, the more of these on the arena, the stronger Ramuh's attacks become. And that was a little confusing to figure out at first, because at first we were just kind of ignoring them, other than the tanks picking them up, because they are also required for a tank mechanic. But then we learned very quickly that that's why we were dying in one hit to the generic room-wide AoE, because there were just way too many of them around. Now, speaking of the tank buster, picking up 3 of these orbs basically gives you a lightning or a conduit resistance, and it's required to survive the tank buster, and it's also required to break a lightning tether during the later phases. And honestly, that became kind of the key to the whole fight, was managing these orbs. If you don't have enough of them when a mechanic is happening, then your tanks can't do their swap correctly. There is a way to play around that by collecting an extra one and taking a healing reduction debuff in exchange for being able to continue to survive those attacks. But yeah, it just becomes a big problem if you don't manage the number of them. And honestly, people just weren't very good at it. Heck, they're probably not very good at it right now if you were to do it with a brand new party. But at the same time, it just makes the fight so engaging. And that's the big thing with a lot of these A Realm Reborn encounters, is some aspect of them is much more engaging than just do the mechanic. You know, oh, this is how the mechanic is solved, do the mechanic. It's a lot about management of the boss and of their skills and of whatever gimmick they may have. And it's something, again, we just don't see that much nowadays. Now, on top of that, you need to free players from a seduction buff with the same thing that left the lightning bolts behind. And that was always a disaster, because you'd have 2 people that would try to do it at the same time. So you'd set up a priority system. Oh man, nowadays priority systems are super normal. You know how bad it was setting up a priority system for Ramuh breaks back then? People just couldn't follow it. You'd have one person go in and another person be like, oh, okay, I'll let them do it. But then the other person sees you coming in, so they step out because they're afraid you're going to come in and you're going to double up and hit. What a time. What a time. It's giving me a headache even just thinking about it. Honestly, the only thing that's really finicky is just people are bad at collecting orbs. Also, I mean, the ads during the ad phase aren't like super interesting, but at the same time, they're certainly not bad. And the only thing I actively disliked about the fight is, because I'm a colorblind player, very colorblind, mind you, the lightning effects during the later part of the fight, they shoot like line AoEs through the arena. I cannot see those lightning bolts for the life of me, because they don't have like a traditional AoE marker on the ground. It just shows this like crackle of lightning that's traveling across before it hits, and I could never see that properly. All right, and number 1, come on. Like, you knew I wasn't going to make Titan Extreme #1 on this list. Hey, it could have been Ramuh, because I really like Ramuh, but if I'm being honest, I just had to put Titan at #1. I could argue Ramuh or Leviathan, but Titan is just so iconic. Get it? Because the Garlands thing. Never mind. Anyway, this fight is the definition of the term extreme, as it amps up every anxious thing that players experience with the hard mode, and the hard mode was scarring enough for most people. More landslides, more tank busters, more weight of the lands, more bombs, more everything. The only thing there was less of, the arena. It's just so small. It's just down to like this little nugget that you're standing on that Titan somehow fits on alongside you. There really are, in my opinion, no faults with the fight's design. That's another, I didn't do that one on purpose. The first one was on purpose. This one was outside of the permanent death mechanic if you fall off, which is kind of synonymous with the fight. Like, if you took that away, it takes away a lot from Titan. So much so that when Unreal came around, they left that. They said, no, if you fall off, you're staying dead. Now, I played with plenty of experienced groups that could, beat this fight with only 5 people alive, but it's not like that's something you wanted to do. And if you fell off and everyone just kept continuing on, you couldn't even watch back then. You would just sit at the bottom of the arena and look at the health bars and just be like, I wonder how they're doing up there. Oh, well, they're not dead yet. So we'll see how that goes. Oh, no, they're still going. Okay. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I don't know. I just think Titan is like the most like extreme. It's everything I expect from an extreme encounter, even to this day. And that's going to be a wrap for my ranking of the A Realm Reborn Extreme Trials. If you have an idea or you'd like to see the other trials in some sort of other video, be sure to let me know in the comment section of the video below. And otherwise, like, favorite, subscribe. You know the drill. You've been around before. Either way, thanks for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. And until then, take care.